Hi everyone, or anyone. I came across a video the other day that I'd like to respond to. It's called, What Talmudic Rabbis Don't Want Gentiles to Know.
Today I'm going to show you something so evil and so vile in this book right here, which I'll be showing you in closer detail, that's probably going to really shock you. And it is certainly something that the Talmudic rabbis do not want people to understand. They don't want people to know.
What I want to start with is a comment that the host himself has attached to the beginning of the comments section. He writes, "Please note, I am not anti-Semitic. I am against the Talmud." Now, I can't say for certain that everyone who says, I'm not a racist, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm not anti-LGBT, or whatever the case may be, I can't say for certain that all of those people are either being deceptive or fooling themselves. But in this case, I would have to say that the very beginning of the video, saying that I'm now going to show you something so vile and evil, suggests that either he is anti-Semitic or he's one of those people who doesn't think there is such a thing as anti-Semitism. Because if that isn't it, then I'm not sure what is. Just as there are now people who will say, well, there's no such thing as racism except when black people call out white people for being racist. So maybe by the same token, he believes that anti-Semitism is something that Jews accuse other people of. Certainly the comments on this video were full of this kind of idea. And it doesn't actually exist on its own terms. Now, what he's going to do here, I'll show you in a moment, is to take a few lines from a passage in the Talmud, which could be interpreted or seem to be very unsavory, and use them apparently to suggest that the whole thing is like this, and all Jews are like this. I should point out that for those of you like the host himself who don't seem to know very much about the Talmud, it's an enormous work compiled over hundreds of years and made up of thousands of pages. So it's more than a little questionable to take, again, a small passage, which he didn't find, as it were. Other people have pointed out the same thing, and use it as ammunition in order to slight the people who created it and the people who are still alive today. Maybe that's why he talks about Talmudic rabbis, because he wants to tar presumably rabbis today as well, and by extension what he calls the Jews, which is again a classic anti-Semitic kind of thing, right? The world isn't made up of individual Jews who are human beings like everyone else, don't agree with each other necessarily, have different ideas, attitudes, some better than others, but to reduce them all into a monolithic group the same way, of course, that the New Testament does, especially in the Gospel of John, where they are clearly the enemy. I also want to point out that the whole premise of this video and the title imply that there's some sort of conspiracy going on to hide the truth, as it were. Now, mind you, this is a man who has no Jewish education, doesn't know Hebrew or Aramaic, and yet there he is holding a book that he can read. Why can he read it? Because it's been translated and published and made available to the public. So if this is a conspiracy, they ought to be doing a much better job. Just the fact that not only is the Talmud written mostly in Aramaic, but that it takes Jews years of study to become familiar with it, and which is actually quite rare in today's Jewish world. The idea that people going out of their way to make it comprehensible are somehow part of a conspiracy is a little strange to me. Not only that, but the edition he's using, which is very popular nowadays, and was written by a rabbi named Adin Steinsaltz, the whole draw of the edition is that, if you will notice in a moment when he opens and shows you the page, most of it is in regular font, and here and there you will see lines in boldface. That's because it's the lines in boldface that represent a literal translation of the text, and all of the surrounding non-boldface text is actually his own edition meant to explain what is going on in the actual translated passages. That is, if you were to open up a more literal translation, and there are some, just to read what was said, even though you had it in English, it would be very hard to understand what was going on, because language itself uses technical terms and alludes to things that the reader is expected to know.
And it is certainly something that the Talmudic rabbis do not want people to understand. They don't want people to know. What I have here is the Talmud, the Steinsaltz edition, volume 7, Tractate Ketubot, part 1. You can see it right there. I did a video on these a little while ago. The whole set, we have the whole thing. Cost us over $2,000 for this. And the fruits of this are going to start paying off. But I'm going to show you something here, which is going to be very horrible. And I'm not going to read certain parts because of YouTube's policies and things. And so I'm going to let you read it. And I don't really like to read horrible, wicked stuff like this. Let me zoom out here a little bit first. Okay. Mishna, whatever the Hebrew is there, it has already been established in a previous Mishnah above 10b that a woman who is presumed to be a virgin at the time of her marriage is entitled to a ketubah of 200 denarim, whereas a woman who is presumed to be a non-virgin at the time of her marriage is entitled to a ketubah, marriage agreement is what a ketubah is, of 100 denarim, a mina, whatever. The Mishnah we are about to consider continues in its efforts to determine which women are considered virgins for the purpose of the ketubah and which are treated as non-virgins. If a grown-up man has intercourse with a less than 3 years old, are you seeing this? And they're not condemning this. Or if a young boy less than 9 years old has had with a grown woman, or if a woman has been injured by a stick and as a result has been ruptured, in each of these cases the woman is entitled to a ketubah of 200 denarim when she marries. Okay, and you can keep on reading there. You can pause it and read it.
Okay, so to start with, this book, this section is called Ketubot, which deals with the laws of marriage. Now, in Jewish marriage, a man is supposed to provide a dowry for the support of the woman, and this is spelled out in the ketubah, the document that's actually given at the wedding. And what they're talking about here is circumstances in which the amount that he is responsible to give her, on the assumption that she's being married for the first time and not a widow or divorced, does not change based on certain unusual circumstances. This is not meant to approve of the situation, simply to describe it. In this Mishnah, for example, we have the case of a woman who, because of an accident, might appear to have lost her virginity. That doesn't mean, of course, that the accident was a good thing, desirable or expected, simply that it might happen. That's not the case for the boy or the girl, because the ages given here, 3 and 9 years old, aren't meant to describe possible events, but rather to give you an outside number. In other words, from that age onward, because eventually they will become physically adults, then the situation would change as far as their eventual marriage. If they did have physical relationships with someone, it's what you'd call in the law a limiting case. Now, quite apart from this general situation and the fact that the Talmud often gives us cases which are meant to be limiting cases to give you a range, whether it be money or age or any other kind of status, we can tell from the bit immediately before this, which he doesn't read to you, that this is not in any sense an approval. It's simply a what-if situation. Let's look at that. Okay, now this is the previous Mishnah. The Talmud is made up of the Mishnah, which is a law code, and then later on the Gemara, which discusses it, was created. This is not the same edition. This is an online, very useful online source tool called Safaria, which contains all sorts of Jewish literature, classic Jewish literature up until the last few hundred years, including, of course, the Talmud. So this is what it says. With regard to a female convert or a captive woman or a maidservant who were ransomed with regard to the captive, or who converted with regard to the convert, or who was freed with regard to the maidservant, when she was less than 3 years and 1 day old, for all of these their marriage contract is 200 dinars, as their presumptive status is that of a virgin. Okay, so like I said a few minutes ago, it's only the boldface words that are actually in the text, and the rest is expanding on it to explain the legal context of this section. Now, I'm not going to get into whether, like many cultures of the time, virginity was valued this way. That's certainly a point that we could discuss, but it's not strictly relevant to the passage. What is relevant is the fact that it's describing cases which are not at all desirable. In other words, by mentioning a captive woman, in other words, there was one of the issues of the time that appears in Jewish law is what do you do with people who have been taken captive by outside forces, say pirates or foreign armies, and then eventually ransomed by the community and brought home. How does that affect their status? And in the case of women, the question is, of course, whether they were abused while they were taken captive, and if they're married and so forth, how does that affect their legal status? So that's what the captive woman is about here. So again, this is not suggesting that the authors of the Talmud were in favor of the idea that Jewish women should be taken captive, nor were they in favor of the idea that a Jewish woman should become a servant to someone else, or for that matter, that a non-Jewish woman should convert. They were allowed to, but it's not as though they're saying that we want as many non-Jewish women as possible to convert to Judaism. So again, the point is that these are all cases in which things have happened or might happen which would affect the legal status of these women, but it is in no way an expression of the positive virtues or desire that these things ought to happen. Notice also that in this Mishnah, like the next one, the three categories that are discussed here, the convert, the captive, and the servant, these are all women, or girls rather, who are less than 3 years and 1 day old. In other words, we're not talking about whether they're old enough to be considered marriageable, any more than we'd be talking about whether they're old enough to be kidnapped by pirates. It's irrelevant to the issue at hand. Okay, so he takes I guess, a little less than 4 minutes out of this video, which is almost 13 minutes long, to explain what it is that's bothering him. And then he spends the remainder of the video talking about how horrible the Jews must be to have written and presumably still abide by something like this. By the way, I'm not aware, not that I'm an expert, but I'm not aware of any actual cases of this sort of thing happening. Certainly there were cases of people being taken captive and things of that sort. And we know because we still have preserved letters that people in various Jewish communities wrote to their leaders asking them what to do in all sorts of cases. These are called responsa. The answers are called responsa. Anyway, I'll give you a bit more of what he now has to say.
Oh, well, that's just conspiracy stuff. That's been debunked. We've fact-checked it, and it's not true. I just showed it to you. Overhead camera just showed you the page and the quotes right here. So that's why they're so evil. That's why they're so bad. Are they? Absolutely. Yeah. But let me give you a verse of scripture.
So, yes, it has been debunked. I don't know what his politics are, but he seems to be adopting the approach that if you mock people you disagree with by stating what you think their claims are in a funny voice, that's basically the same thing as actually pointing out what's wrong with those opinions. So here he's I'm not sure who he's referring to when he switches, still in a funny voice, to the people who say that the Jews are evil, only to then say, yes, that's true, because it wouldn't be the first group who are presumably not saying that, because they're showing that his position has been proven incorrect. But either way, it's clear that he does take that position. At the very beginning of the video, he used the words evil and vile, not live. Let's see, are there any others? I guess those are all the anagrams. But that's his position throughout this thing. So now he spent less than 4 minutes in a video about 13 minutes long explaining what he thinks is wrong with the Talmud. And he seems to think that when he talks about it's not just the specific thing, it's the whole thing, which he's branding. But now he's going to move on to his home base, you could say, to quoting from the New Testament, which, as we know, contains some pretty derisive things about Jews in general and why they are sinners.
Jump up 2 verses to verse 13. Who was before a blasphemer and a persecutor and injurious, but I obtained mercy because I did it ignorantly in unbelief. Did you know that Jesus Christ died for sinners? Did you know that Paul said that he was the chiefest of sinners? Paul was a Jew.
Okay, so Paul was a Jew, but like the man in Monty Python and the Holy Grail who was turned into a newt, he got better. He did this by recognizing Christ. Now, he's going to go on to say that even though, given what he has said about Jews and what his audience presumably thinks about Jews, it would not be best to simply eliminate them all, because even they, if they choose to give up their stubbornness, can be saved.
Paul talks about being a Jew over and over again. And what a lot of you people forget out there is, you look at something like that I just showed you and you say, oh, wicked. I just have to rip their throats out. Do this kind of thing. You forget the message of the scriptures, that Jesus Christ came to his own and his own received him not. Well, you say, then they're done. No, because Paul wasn't done. Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Who art thou, Lord? I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. Oh, but sorry, Saul, because you're those wicked Jews, those evil, horrible, Talmudic Jews. And a lot of these traditions, they go back, by the way, into the BC years, before Christ. That's what BC means. It's not BCE, before the common era, before the common error with the whole system. No, it's before Christ. And AD, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. That's the way it's supposed to be. Jesus Christ is God. God manifest in the flesh. I've proved it for years and years. It's what the King James Bible teaches. And you wicked Jews out there, you qualify to be saved.
So out of the goodness of his heart, the born-again barbarian wants to help the Jews stop sinning, rather than seeing them wiped out, as some of his audience presumably would like to. I have to say that in my experience over the years with evangelicals, which is not great, but I have met some and certainly listened and watched to what many have had to say, there's this particular kind of arrogance. Maybe it's partly because these people tend to be Americans who are importing the idea that we're number one and so on into their version of Christianity. But the idea that we know better than you what you should do and what you have done, it just strikes me as so incredibly arrogant and presumptuous. Even, I would say, Christians that are much better intentioned than this man is, certainly much nicer, and that they're coming from a place of care. Even a lot of them seem to feel that they do know better. Then again, you have missionaries who go to places and genuinely do good things, but out of a conviction, at least to some degree, that they're helping the people in those places to know things that they ought to know, but don't and should. I'd like to finish with a bit of an experiment. I'm going to read a couple of passages from the Theodosian Code, which is one of the two most important collections of classical Roman law. Now, the Theodosian Code dates from around the same time as the Talmud, and it's from the Byzantine Empire, in other words, the eastern part of the Roman Empire, which by then had embraced Christianity as the state religion ever since Constantine. So even though the law deals with all sorts of subjects, it has some provisions that specifically promote Christianity and persecute, or limit at least, the practice of other religions, including Judaism. So let's have a look at some paragraphs. The first of these is called Jews and Christians May Not Marry One Another. No Jew shall receive a Christian woman in marriage, nor shall a Christian man contract a marriage with a Jewish woman. For if any person should commit an act of this kind, the crime of this misdeed shall be considered as the equivalent of adultery, and freedom to bring accusation shall be granted also to the voices of the public. The following provision is called Christians may not become Jews. In accordance with the venerable law which has been established, we command that if any person should be converted from Christianity to Judaism and should join their sacrilegious gatherings, when the accusation has been proved, his property shall be vindicated to the ownership of the fisc. The fisc was the imperial treasury. So anyone who converts will lose his property, and it will go to the government. Now, the reason I read these paragraphs was because I wanted to point out that here we have one of the two main codes of Roman law, which would eventually become the foundation of European law, not so much American or British, but still a very important aspect of modern Western law. And yet, it contains passages that to modern democracies would be considered antithetical. So if we were to take the approach of the born-again barbarian, we would say, yes, this is a disgusting code. It contains things that are anathema to us, and therefore not only these texts, but the whole of the Western legal tradition should be condemned, which of course it hasn't been and isn't today. So maybe when trying to condemn and blacken all of Jewish tradition on the basis of a few paragraphs, which, as we showed, in and of themselves are not objectionable, but even if there are things which I think you could say, which a modern Western sensibility would find inappropriate, just as there are things about any ancient culture, or medieval for that matter, which we would find objectionable, we set it aside, we criticize it, and we move on without getting on our high horses, our great superior horses, and condemning that entire culture because there are things about it that we no longer find just or appropriate. So that's all I have to say about this, and I would welcome open-minded and polite comments. Thank you.